Afternoon, and welcome to our New York Archives Magazine online speaker series. I'm Josie Madison, editor of New York Archives. Today's event features guest speaker Hugh Ryan for an illuminating session titled Documenting LGBTQIA+ History in New York. Over the next hour, we'll explore the importance of preserving the rich and diverse histories of LGBTQIA+ communities across New York City. Our speaker will highlight significant archival efforts, notable collections, and the challenges of capturing and sustaining these vital narratives. This session offers a compelling look at the work being done to ensure these stories are not only remembered, but honored for generations to come. Hugh Ryan is the award-winning author of When Brooklyn Was Queer and The Women's House of Detention. He teaches creative nonfiction in the MFA program at the Bennington Writing Seminars and runs the Queer History 101 book club at allstora.com with the world-famous performer Peppermint. For the last 5 years, he has worked with the New York City Department of Education to create syllabi, teacher guides, posters, lesson plans, and comics on LGBTQ+ history. Thomas J. Ruller retired from his position as New York State Archivist, a role he held since 2015. An active professional for 35 years, he's the author of several peer-reviewed journal articles and reviews on the use of technology in archives and the preservation of records in electronic form. Tom has been a consultant for several state governments and other organizations focusing on electronic records management and preservation. He remains actively engaged as a board member and steward of the Archives Partnership Trust. So welcome to those of you who have joined us today. I just want to let you know that there will be a brief question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So if you have questions, you can feel free to submit them throughout the presentation using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll set aside a few minutes at the end to get to as many of those as we can. And now, without further ado, I am pleased to introduce Hugh Ryan and Tom Ruller.
Thank you, Josie, and hello, Hugh.
Hi, Tom, and thank you, Josie. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, everyone in this Zoom on a beautiful June day. I'm always shocked when so many people are willing to sit in front of a computer on a day like this. So it's a real honor to be here.
Well, thank you. And what's wonderful about the modern world today, you can sit outside and be on your computer nowadays.
That is so true. I gotta remember, like, I'm so chained to my desk in all things. I could be doing this outside.
Right, right. But there might be, the occasional bird, dog, car, airplane,
Visitor.
my neighborhood helicopter.
Hmm.
But again, thank you for agreeing to have this conversation today. The kind of historian that you are is one of the most important ones, I think, in our business and in our world, because it's easy to write about the history that everyone, I don't want to say the history that everyone knows about, but the history that we see and interact with all the time. Telling the stories that aren't often told or that are very difficult to tell, that require a deep dive into places that are hard to find, is a really important kind of history. And I personally, and I know a lot of folks, are extremely grateful for the work that you do in surfacing stories that haven't been told very well or very often before. So thank you, Hugh.
Thank you very much. I mean, it's an honor to do it. I love my work. I would do it no matter what. But I think that it shows what kind of moment we're in and how the world has changed, both from when I started doing this work and when I was a kid growing up taking history classes, that we're doing this through the New York Archives. I mean, this is incredible. So I think we all have our role in making these histories more noticeable, more visible, more shared, and more part of our common history. So thank you, Tom.
You're welcome. Well, let's talk about your research a little bit. You've done a lot of work uncovering stories of the LGBTQIA plus communities across the boroughs outside of Manhattan. So, can you talk a little bit about that? We all know about Stonewall and all that, but talk a little bit more about the boroughs beyond Manhattan.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am an outer borough kid. I mean, to be honest, I grew up in the suburbs, but my mom is from the Bronx, and so is most of my family. So I have a big connection to not Manhattan, but New York City. And so I've always been interested in these other histories, right? And it wasn't until I moved to Brooklyn in the early 2000s that I started to realize that at that point I had been a women's studies major. I had read a lot of like what gay history existed in the 90s. But I didn't know anything at all about Brooklyn or Queens or Staten Island, and I knew only the tiniest bit of the Bronx, the places where I went to go visit my relatives, and I heard about Little Belfast, the area of Norwood that was so Irish. So for me, uncovering these histories was really this moment about 2010. There was this actual exhibit down at the Smithsonian in DC called Hide Seek. It was the first ever queer exhibit at the Smithsonian. It was looking at difference and desire in American portraiture. And an artist that I love, David Warnerovich, was in it, and he was pulled from it after a conservative outcry. And there were all of these protests about censorship at the Smithsonian. And I got involved, and then I had this weird moment where I was like, wait, why am I protesting the Smithsonian for pulling this one piece of queer history from this incredible show when I can't go anywhere in New York and learn anything about queer history, and I don't know anything about it either. And this set me to starting an organization called the Pop-Up Museum of Queer History. And through that, I did all of these exhibitions around the country. In 2013, we returned to Brooklyn. We were going to do a local Brooklyn show. We'd done local shows in Philly, we'd done local shows in Manhattan, we'd done local shows out in Bloomington, Indiana. Everywhere we went, people were excited to talk about local queer history. When we tried to do it in Brooklyn, we discovered nobody knew anything. We got almost no proposals. The first time this had ever happened. And in that moment, I realized like my ignorance was everyone's ignorance. That there were people out there who knew bits of this history, and especially people who had lived through parts of this history, the parts of the 20th century at least. But when it went further back than that, there was nothing. I went to the library thinking I would find a book, probably an old one published in like the early 80s by Firebird or Allison or Calamus or one of the other small gay presses. But there was nothing. I thought there'd be a documentary. I couldn't find anything. I thought there'd be interviews. There'd be a YouTube channel even. But no, the queer history of Brooklyn was a mystery. And so I applied to a grant from the New York Public Library to research this question. And this is where I first started to understand truly the history, not just of queer Brooklyn, but the history of New York City and the history of what it means to be queer in America at all. Because the fascinating thing about Brooklyn, for me at least, one of the many fascinating things, is that the time period in which it becomes a city, so the 19th century, the Erie Canal opens up in the 1820s, right? That transforms everything in America. All trade starts coming down through New York now. Only Manhattan is already overburdened. There's no new space at the docks for more shipping and more trade and everything that's coming from the Erie Canal. So everything moves to Brooklyn. So starting in the 1820s, Brooklyn urbanizes. And in fact, this is happening across the country in the 19th century. America is urbanizing. We go from a place where about 6% of people live in cities to a place where about 60% of people live in cities. And this change affects everything in the entire world, and particularly our understanding of sexuality. Because before this moment, before this time in which we become city dwellers as a country, the idea of homosexuality is much closer to a third sex model, right? It's not about who you have sex with, it's how you live your gender presentation, which sex is part of that, but it's not the main part. We have what are called inverts or fairies or mannish women. They're considered a category that is body based, right? Your body is physically different from a normal man or a normal woman. That makes sense in the Victorian era because all men spend their time with other men, all women spend all their time with other women, and you're really visible if you cross those gender lines. Whereas if you're just a normal gendered man who loves another normally gendered man, that's considered entirely appropriate in the Victorian era. You're meant to write poetry to one another and spend all your time with each other. So homosexuals didn't see themselves, they didn't understand themselves the way we think about it today. So urbanization happens. Brooklyn urbanizes. All of these people start moving to cities for the kinds of economic opportunities that all cities provide us and the kinds of social opportunities that all cities provide us. And for the first time, all around America, the people we understand as gender normative homosexuals begin to find one another in large groups, generally along the waterfront or in other places where they could get jobs, right? And in finding each other, they begin to notice they have commonalities. And as they notice these commonalities, folks like Walt Whitman, who loved the docks and was himself queer and was a writer in Brooklyn in the 1850s, start to document their lives. And slowly, scientists and sexologists and journalists and justices of the peace and the police and moral reformers, they all begin to notice these same new, quote unquote, homosexuals, and they begin to define them, right? So that's why at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, we suddenly have this flourishing of homosexuals in the archives, not because they're new, but because it's a new definition, a new understanding of what it means even to be queer that was made possible by the emergence of cities in America. And it happened at the same time Brooklyn emerges as a city. So I realized in looking into the history of Brooklyn that I could chart what it meant for the gay community that we know today to become the gay community that we know today. That in fact, that history is intimately tied up with Brooklyn's history because Brooklyn is attached to Manhattan. So what happens in Brooklyn spreads throughout the country, even before Brooklyn is a really large city of its own. So, very long-winded answer to that question that you asked there. But I would say this, the thing that I most came to in researching when Brooklyn was queer is an understanding of the ways in which urbanization and the idea of homosexuality twined around one another to co-create each other. Our ideas of cities and our ideas of gay people are all birthed in that kind of storm.
This is not a question that you and I discussed earlier, but you mentioned the Erie Canal and sort of the increase in communication channels and sort of, I don't want to say spreading the word, but it facilitated people being able to share ideas and concepts that much better. So, do you think that there's a connection between both urbanization and greater awareness and definition of people and who they are, and spreading that awareness and definition farther and wider through channels like the Erie Canal?
Absolutely. And it's not just the canal, but the canal is like the big one, right? But after that moment, we start to get, post-Civil War, this big boom in newspapers all around the country. And those newspapers print things from different places, right? So there's this sudden national culture that's emerging. At the same time, we have vaudeville and minstrel shows and the theater, and those things are also emerging out of Manhattan and out of Brooklyn, largely Coney Island and downtown Brooklyn, and they are going around the world. And in these shows, they are creating these stereotypical characters that we're all sort of familiar with, right? They're negative stereotypes of the drunken Irish Paddy, say. But they also are creating the stereotype of the fairy and the managed woman. They are part of our popular culture. And so as trade changes, right, it's always economics that pushes this stuff along. I'm very much a materialist historian. But as that changes, it takes all these other things with it. Even just the idea of being a sailor, which, if you do that locally, say just on the river that you grew up near, say the Mississippi, you are going to intercept all of these other people coming with goods, with all of these other ideas. And maybe you're going to take a ship down to Africa, you're going to take a ship over to Europe, you're going to get exposed to all of these different things. So the economic part of the Erie Canal and this other sort of network of trade is only one small part of what it does. It creates jobs and possibilities in cities, which create possibilities for queer life. Those queer lives are then transmitted through theater, through newspaper reports, through a lot of crime records. All of these ways in which information spreads thanks to trade brings these ideas that, again, are being developed in urbanizing spaces around the country.
Thank you. Well, let's go back to Brooklyn a little bit. And, Brooklyn, parts of Brooklyn are very old, settled by the Dutch in the 1600s in the 17th century. And there were long-standing gay and lesbian communities in Brooklyn that flourished over time, despite a lot of social and legal constraints. And how were those communities able to flourish and establish themselves? You've talked about it a little bit. They were sort of, no one paid attention to it. But, again, starting at probably really in the late 19th century, we start to see more of those constraints being applied. But the community still grew and flourished in some respects. Can you talk a little bit about how they were able to do that?
Yeah, I mean, the first big thing, right, is that we have to have a shared definition for homosexuality, which doesn't, as I said, begin to really emerge until after the 1850s. At that moment, there becomes the possibility for creating these larger communities because the idea of what it means to be LGBT grows. It's not just this small category of what was called the invert, which we might think of as being somewhat similar to a combination of what we think of as being intersex and being transgender, right? It's about your gender performance being wrong, it's about your body being wrong. It was very hard to live in those days as an inverted person. You were either stealth, you were hiding, or you were probably being persecuted to some degree, or you were really rich, and then you could kind of maybe get around everything a little bit. But once this idea emerges of homosexuality and transness loosely, that takes a little while longer, but as these ideas are fomenting, we have all of these people who previously did not consider themselves generally all that different from other people, but they're emerging in these cities. They're showing up there because maybe they did feel a little bit different, or maybe they just need a job, or maybe their home life was not great. All the reasons that people come to cities, anyways, right? But they begin to find one another. And it's this finding each other that's so important because in that moment, what to them had been an experience that maybe it made them feel different or maybe it didn't, but they didn't know anyone else having that experience. And as cities provided spaces for them to meet each other through the most important archetypal experience of queerness in the 19th century, cruising. Right? Cruising does not require language. The meeting of someone else's eyes on the street and communicating desire can happen without a word for what you are or a word for what you want. And it happens in gender segregated spaces, which cities are full of in the 19th century, right? Women are meant to spend all their time in women's parlors or with other domestic servants who work for women. They eat in restaurants that serve women if they eat in public at all, right? Men are working these dockside jobs, living in these saloon house, boarding houses, basically, where there are no other women. There are large numbers of immigrant communities. They're coming over in this time as bachelor communities. So there's really no appropriate idea of dating or marriage. All of this is what makes the gay community start to seem different and thus begin to find each other. It's these economic possibilities, right? So they can get jobs as sailors, they can get jobs in the saloons, they can get jobs as entertainers, they can get jobs in factories, all things that only require the body. They can get jobs as sex workers. All that economic possibility allows them to start finding each other, talking to each other, and developing networks between each other. If you read Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, the book is largely a collection of poems about understanding what it means to be the new urban American, right? What it means to be a New Yorker or a Brooklynite and the exciting things that we learn in cities. And gay identity is one of the things that's threaded throughout that book. He talks about them that love as I myself am capable of loving and starts to propose language like adhesiveness for gay love or camarado for your lovers or the calamus flower as a flower to be exchanged between young men who are in love, right? So all of these people start to define the community that's developing because of economic possibility. So in any space where you have a working waterfront, an entertainment district, sex segregated factory work, you find these kinds of small proto gay communities forming. And there's just a lot of them in Brooklyn because Brooklyn, by the end of the 19th century, is considered the second city in the empire. It's second only in size to Manhattan. So it has this really robust community in it. Communities, actually. They develop down in downtown Brooklyn, the part closest to Manhattan. They develop down at Coney Island. Coney Island actually has a really interesting history because at the same time gay people are finding each other, all these straight people are in these cities and suddenly they're hanging out as well. And it becomes a little bit weird if you're the kind of guy who wants to spend all your time with other guys. If you could be going to Coney Island to these new amusement parks and dating a girl, the whole world of dating, treating, and unchaperoned socializing between men and women, that becomes popular in cities at the end of the 19th century as well. So while the gay community is finding each other because they have these economic abilities and they're seeing each other in large numbers for the first time, the straight community over here is deciding what it means to be heterosexual. And that means dating and cross gender socializing and marriages that are more passionate, not economic. So city life helps straight people see each other better and gay people see each other better as we understand them today and provides the kind of economic opportunities where those people can begin to spend time together and create the first queer communities, which really start to emerge in Brooklyn Probably around the early 1900s. There's evidence before that of individual gay people. There's even evidence of some bars, some places where maybe they're gathering, but you don't really see the emergence of like what we might call a queer community anywhere that we can find in the public records until the early 1900s. The closest is down at Coney Island, where you have these freaks and performers who play with gender. We don't know a lot about them as individuals, but they definitely had a world of their own. Going back to your question earlier, they are some of the people who are traveling the country in these small groups of other freaks, other performers, and bringing ideas about what it means to be gender variant everywhere. So it's possible that in Coney Island, there's something a little bit earlier than the rest of Brooklyn. But for most part, these kind of actual communities you're talking about, they're popping up in the late 1800s, early 1900s.
Great. Well, you mentioned Walt Whitman, and these communities really do start to coalesce more about the time that Walt is living. Well, he lived in Brooklyn for a very long time, but so to what extent do you think that those communities really nurtured and helped him in both his writing and his personal experience and his personal growth?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you look at his records, you'll see that he kept journals of the men that he met on the street. I mean, sometimes they go for like 17 pages at a time with just these one-line entries that say things like Gus, 25, had the French pox, which is syphilis. Or he'll write about whether they slept with him or not. Now, he doesn't say what that means. Did they share a bed? Did they have sex? But it's clear that he is looking for young men who love as I am capable of loving. That's the way that he puts it. This community nurtures him. This community inspires him. And we can see it not just in Brooklyn, though it's obviously strong in Brooklyn, but around the world, other proto-gay men really begin to notice what Whitman is doing. Bram Stoker, who wrote Dracula, writes these incredible letters to him. John Eddington Simons, I believe, also comes to visit him. He's a very early sort of gay identity theorist from England. There are a number of people in the federal government who write scathing reviews of Leaves of Grass, Whitman's first book, because of its beastly obscenity and sensuality, right? So people in the know understand what Whitman is doing and understand what he's trying to document because it is this whole world that he is not only coming up through, but he's using to define what it means to be an American in the 1850s and 1860s. So I think that these communities, even though later in his life he really denies a lot of them, he starts telling stories about how he fell in love with a woman in New Orleans and had 6 children, that have never been found. And early versions of poems that he wrote at that time have been found where he crosses out he and him and replaces them with she and her. So there's obviously some effort at some point in his life to redact some of this openness that he'd had in the 1850s and 60s. But I think there's no denying that Leaves of Grass is in large part inspired by his experiences in the kind of like working class white queer milieu in the Brooklyn waterfront, and then in some of the like racier, more exciting bars in Manhattan, like Pfaff's, which was a sort of bohemian Rathskeller in the 1860s.
So it wasn't just the Jack Kerouac era where people hung out in these bars and grew personally. Cool.
Oh, no, I will say, actually, I would say Kerouac's in some ways, it's sort of the end. Like bars used to mean so much more. If you didn't have drinkable water in your house, the bar is where you went. If you didn't have a bank account, the saloon would cash your check. If you couldn't get mail somewhere, you would get it at the bar, right? They were bars, yeah, they were saloons, yes, but they were also centers in ways that they are not anymore.
Community centers, which I guess when you look at the sort of the ideal of some small European communities, the pub is the center of the community.
Exactly.
Let's stick to Brooklyn a little bit. Walt Whitman, very famous. A lot of people know about him and know about his life. But there are a lot of other great Brooklyn stories, and you tell a number of them. And can we just highlight a couple? E. Trondle. Can you talk a little bit? It was in the newspapers. It was kind of important. Can you talk a little bit about E. Trondle?
Yeah, yeah. So first thing I'm going to say is that after I wrote When Brooklyn Was Queer, I actually found the name that Trondle lived under, which was Big Cliff. So I'm going to refer to him as Big Cliff. Big Cliff Trondle was arrested in Brooklyn in 1913 because he was a trans man. Very much our modern idea of a trans man, the first one that I can come across in Brooklyn's history definitively. I found other people who are arrested for wearing men's clothing, living under men's names, but Trondle is really interesting because he's quite young when he's arrested this time. He's 17 years old, and the case gets all this newspaper coverage because he refuses to change into a women's outfit. And when he's brought in front of the judge, he says, I am going to write to President Woodrow Wilson and demand that I be allowed to live as I please. And he makes this economic argument, which you see a lot in this moment. A lot of people who are really gender nonconforming will say either, I had to do this to get work because I couldn't get work as a woman, so that's the reason I'm doing this. Or they'll say, I'm already so gender variant that everyone assumed I wasn't a woman. And so I had to live as a man. I had no other choice, right? The economic imperative is always used as a functional excuse in public, a way to try and get what you want. But writing to Woodrow Wilson makes Big Cliff Trondle a star, and his case gets covered in newspapers across the country. The interesting thing is this. The law that he's arrested under is actually from the 1840s, and it was a law that said it's illegal to wear a mask while committing another crime or to wear a disguise because these upstate farmers were dressing as Native Americans and rioting and fighting off tax collectors. So when he gets arrested, magistrate says, there's no crime here. He was not committing another crime, and so it's legal for him to dress as he wants. He's released. And it's a social worker who gets him rearrested because social work and police as we know them, they develop at the same time and they are really intimately connected in very disturbing ways. So this social worker gets him rearrested under a new charge associating with idle and vicious persons in order to get a new magistrate. And the new magistrate sends him to jail saying, I am sending you to jail because no girl would wear men's clothes unless she was a moral pervert. Right. So what we see here is that he's arrested under a law, let go, arrested under a new law that's a totally trumped up charge to get at that initial concern that he was queer and trans. Right. So the law exists, but it does whatever it wants. Once he's arrested, he goes to a reformatory for 3 years. Reformatories were these places that were like forced feminization prisons. They took young women who were improperly feminine and tried to turn them into proper wives, maids, and mothers, which is literally what the jail says in its annual report, that they were trying to turn women into proper wives, maids, and mothers, because those are the only jobs women could have. If you were not properly feminine, you could never be a wife or a maid, so you would end up on the street where you would become a prostitute. Of course, the exact opposite is what happens to Trondle. He is not a prostitute. He has no interest in being wife or maid. But when he goes to jail, he gets trained by the other people there in prostitution and drug trading. So he spends the rest of his life in and out of jails, addicted to heroin, arrested for prostitution over and over again, all because he is forced into this 3-year program at a place called Bedford Hills in upstate New York, where while he was there, a big scandal happened. They were literally torturing the people who were there. They would be suspended from their hands from the ceiling until they wet themselves. They would be tied to steel mattress or steel bed springs for days at a time. It was a terrible and awful place. But Trondle disappeared from the records entirely. When I wrote When Brooklyn Was Queer, after he got sent to Bedford prison, I never found him again. Until like 6 years later, I was doing research for my next book, The Women's House of Detention, about a prison in Manhattan, and I came across a 200-page file documenting everything that happened in his life from that point on. That's how I learned he was named Big Cliff. That's how I learned that he's buried today in Mount Olivet Cemetery. So you can go and visit him, though there is no marker. But he has this tremendous story, the kind that you almost never find when it comes to trans men in this period in the archives.
Wow. Okay. There's another story that kind of piqued my interest, which is the Nazi spy ring. Um,
Yes.
and of course, Brooklyn had a big German community and an important Navy yard during the World War II. So it was a strategic location. Can you talk a little bit about the Nazi spy ring and its connection to the queer community?
Yeah, the swastika swishery, as it was famously called in the newspapers, which in the 1940s was also said to be the biggest scandal to ever affect the US Senate. What happened is this. There was a Swedish guy named Gustav Beekman who, before World War II, had been a brothel runner all around Manhattan. Sex work was a huge business in New York City right up until World War I, when there starts to be these crackdowns. A thing called the American Plan, which is aiming at arresting women for passing venereal disease to soldiers. So this crackdown starts, but eventually it starts to get to the gay brothels as well. And things get hotter and hotter and hotter. So he starts off keeping places for a very long period of time. Then he starts jumping around. He eventually lands in Brooklyn, where he's running a brothel that specializes in men in the armed services, right? So you could come there anytime, day or night, and request a sailor, a soldier, an Air Forceman. And they're all coming, as you mentioned, from the Brooklyn Navy Yard. The Office of Naval Intelligence gets wind of this during the war, early 1942, and they start watching. They set up a spy nest from the top floor of a hospital nearby, and they keep track of everybody going in and out. And it's huge business. There are tons of people going in and out. And so eventually they conduct a sting and they arrest Gustav Beekman and a couple of the merchant marines and the sailors who are working as sex workers. They are convinced that there's no way to make money on a gay brothel. No one could be making money here. So when Gustav Beekman is obviously making a lot of money, they're incensed. Something is wrong. Something doesn't add up. They start leaning on the guys that they've arrested, saying they're going to drop all of these charges on them unless they give them some evidence. Who are the rich people going there? Who are the successful people? Who are the big names? Who's really backing this? One of the guys says he remembers a man named Walsh, who was a doctor, who he thought was rich. And out of nowhere, the district attorney for Brooklyn, who really wants to make a name for himself at this time, becomes convinced that this Walsh is Senator David Walsh from Boston, about whom gay rumors have been swirling for over a decade, right? He actually was gay. He was in love with a man who I think worked as his servant and chauffeur publicly. But they become convinced that there is in fact a senator who is going to this brothel, and that it's all a front for Nazi spies who are trying to get information from these senators and from these sailors. There's one particular spy named William Ebersoft, who they're convinced it's him. He actually runs a rival brothel, so he is there occasionally, but he has his own brothel full of sailors and soldiers. He has no need to go to Beekman's to run this kind of scam. But they're just convinced there's no other way to make money. And this becomes a huge scandal. It dominates the airwaves. It's on those little, excuse me, little films before the movies, little news clips. It's so big, it's entered into the Senate record. A giant private investigation is taken on by Dorothy Schiff, who runs the New York Post, which takes years to figure it out. Eventually, what it comes down to is absolutely nothing. There are no spies. The senator was never there. The guys they arrested were just sex workers. And Gustav Beekman is actually, they just never believe him. And so they send him to jail for years up at a maximum security prison, Ossining, Sing Sing prison, where in the records, I found that he was referred to as Mother Beekman. And eventually he is let go, but many years later, and he dies shortly thereafter. So it's this huge case over absolutely nothing. But I had this great quote that I wanted to share with you from that particular case, because it is shocking and unexpected, and it made me wonder, so if there weren't spies at this brothel, what was it really like? And I found a diary from a German immigrant who went there. So this is from a little bit before the arrest. This is what he described a visit to Gustav Beekman's house as being. His living room was warm and cozy. Young servicemen were sitting on sofas and easy chairs, relaxed and friendly. Coffee and snacks were being served. Light banter went back and forth. We felt as if we had entered a happy family circle. George, that's Gustav, being dad and mom combined. He knew the boys' problems, helped when he could, supplied shelter, food, and money, and was loved with the casual affection that children show their parents. He confided to us newcomers this was a bad night. All the boys had to report for duty, and soon they left, kissing George goodbye. When they'd gone, he asked us not to be disappointed and named a good night for us to return, a night when several ships were due in harbor. He then proceeded in a business-like fashion to inquire about our tastes in servicemen. What color of eyes and hair do you prefer? He asked. Do you like them tall, medium, or your own size? All details were jotted down in George's notebook. Is there any nationality you like best? He asked, and then he described how nationalities differed in anatomical as well as temperamental qualities. Even the branch of service was left to our choice, for George commanded an unlimited supply. Yeah,
That
hard to imagine.
very hard to imagine. Quite the I'll say the businessman. Uh,
Yeah, and the way that it worked, that report that I mentioned from the Post found two women who had lived there. One of them was married to one of the sex workers, and it was her and her mother. And she said, "We loved it there. We got such a big kick out of all the fairies. It was really fun." And he didn't charge anything. He sort of like rented the rooms, and whatever happened inside them was up to the people between them. So he got a little bit of money from everybody who were using the rooms. He sold some snacks and people gave him tips because he made introductions. But he was not exactly what we think of as a pimp. He ran sort of more a sexual social house.
mm, great story. Thank you. And again, a reminder to everyone, you can read the full story in the book, When Brooklyn Was Queer. Let's shift from Brooklyn a little bit and go to Manhattan. You mentioned it earlier, your other book about the Women's House of Detention. And can you talk about any reason why this house, this prison, was located in Greenwich Village in Manhattan? Was it a symbolic, hey, we're the government and we can imprison you here, or was it just a happenstance?
It becomes that, but it actually has a much bigger, broader, and unexpected history. So, the Women's House of Detention, 12-story maximum security prison and jail. Prison is where you go after you're sentenced. Jail is where you go while you're on trial or otherwise before sentencing. It's 12 stories. It's located right in the heart of Greenwich Village, sort of at the intersections of 6th Avenue and 10th Street. And it's there from 1932 to 1974. So it's like this dominant institution in Greenwich Village. But the reason it's there is because right after the Revolution, American Revolution in the 1700s, there needed to be a new prison built. There's a prison crisis, an overcrowding crisis. During wars, we don't arrest a ton of people, just in general. We don't put them in jail. After the war, huge numbers of arrests, many, many people being put into jail. So you always get these overcrowding crises. The first prison to open up in New York State after the Revolution opens up in Greenwich Village when it was still a village very far away from New York City. In fact, you had to take the ferry up there. The phrase "up the river" to mean being sent into prison, that gets defined by this. When you were sent from New York City proper, which was the financial district, up to Greenwich Village, up the river. The prison that is established there becomes a tourist attraction and a center for industry and helps to make that town famous and rich. Many people who live there now make a lot of money. Basically, their land becomes more and more important. As the city grows closer and closer, it eventually takes over Greenwich Village and the prisons remain. There's a prison there for a long time. And so when the city establishes the first 24-hour watch force, the first thing that we think of as like a regular police force like we have today, they put one of the centers of it right next to the prison in Greenwich Village. And so when we actually divide the entire city up into into police bureaus, because now we're all the 5 boroughs have joined together into one city, one of them is headquartered again in Greenwich Village. And because there is a police station there, they add a police court, which is a place to hold people for short term, a pen. And they add a courthouse as well. And so that spot in Greenwich Village has been a center for incarceration and policing for hundreds of years, long before the Women's House of Detention is ever built. But in 1910, this law gets passed called the Page Law. Does tons of things you cannot even imagine. It reconsolidates the entire court system. It creates all of these new charges and new arrests for women. So basically, if you were a woman who was arrested for being improperly feminine after 1910, you could be held for up to 3 years, an indeterminate sentence, until you were deemed properly feminine, and then you would be released. All of this is because of this 1910 Page Law. And since so much of it focused on the incarceration and arrest of women, it mandated that there be a jail specifically for women, not a prison, a jail that be near a courthouse for women, because it also established women's courts, which started in the early 1900s. These were courts that only ever handled basically 3 charges: disorderly conduct, prostitution, and public drunkenness. Sometimes they handle shoplifting as well. This court gets established where the police court had been. So it's there in the 19 teens and 20s. And because of that, the Women's House of Detention eventually gets built there as well. They try for about a decade or two to move it other places. It does not work out. Funny enough, when the prison gets closed down in the 60s, one of the things the local residents say is like, we are landowners in Manhattan, and this prison has been inflicted upon us, and it's pulling down property rates. When in fact, the prison was there before they were there, and the prison made the rise in property rates in Greenwich Village. It created Greenwich Village as we know it today, but that history has been completely obscured in the modern era by people who only looked at the history of the House of Detention and not the 200 years of incarceration in Greenwich Village before that.
Thank you for that. But let's talk a little more about this prison slash jail. Closed in 1974. Later in its history, over its history, it included a number of people among its detainees. Dorothy Day, Angela Davis. But it also had a reputation in its later years for abuse and mistreatment of people. Can you talk a little bit about those later days and how some of those who were incarcerated there were treated?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say this, that reputation actually goes back to day one.
Oh,
It was a cold and cruel place from the moment it opened. There was this moment before it opened. So, uh, late 1800s, early 1900s, it's the progressive era. They have this idea, we need to build more beautiful prisons because we're not just incarcerating people, we're fixing their souls, a penitentiary where someone is brought to penance, right? So the building on the outside looks kind of beautiful. It's the only Art Deco prison in the world. And there was this sense that maybe people inside it were being coddled. But it's built in the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, and it opens in the Great Depression. So by the time it opens, there's no money. This kind of penitence and reform, there's no interest in that anymore. All of these parts of the building that were supposed to be there, this giant hospital for folks who are drug addicted or had venereal disease, get taken out. They get reduced down to a single floor. By the period you're talking about, it's destroyed entirely. And the records are really spotty. One of the things you'll learn if you ever do this kind of research into prisons is that they're constantly destroying their own records. They're erasing things because every 20 years we look back and realize what we've been doing is immoral, and absolutely people would be arrested for it. And so in the records, what you tend to find is only as things are being fixed are they noted as being broken. So there comes a moment where they write in one of the reports in the 60s, I think, that water has been restored in the dining halls, which for many years had been broken. How many years? What did they do for water? Never explained. So the prison looks crueler and crueler over time, but that's just a function of how the reports are hidden and destroyed. And the one way in which it actually does get crueler and crueler over time is overcrowding. It starts off and it's meant to hold 300 people. By the time it closes, it's holding about 800 people, right? So it is extremely overcrowded. And it's overcrowded for about 30 of the 40 years of its existence. A large part of that is due to the change in drug laws in the mid 20th century, right? We start arresting way more people. Morphine, heroin, cannabis, all of this was legal in the early 1900s when these laws were first being written that established the prison. By the time the prison is built, not only are they illegal, but we have a vast dragnet of forces that combines national law enforcement and FBI budgets with local police sting operations. And so the prison is being filled with women arrested on drug charges where they are forced into the junk tank. So they're cold turkey kick. And then they are put on Thorazine, where they're heavily medicated with these drugs that leave them zombie-like, but still able to move around and listen to orders. And then they are dumped on the streets. So from the 50s up until the 70s, when it closes, that's the real cycle of cruelty that we're seeing over and over again. They are picking up women who are drug addicts. They are pumping them full of a different kind of drug. Then they are dropping them back on the street where they are still addicted. They pick them back up again, and it becomes this rotating drawer. And most of the arrests move into drug-related arrests, from prostitution arrests to drug-related arrests. Also at that time, there's a lot of concern about communists and Black liberation activists and civil rights activists. And so the prison becomes a hub for arresting people, particularly Black musicians who there's a crackdown because they're seen as the forefront of the Black civil rights movement, right? They travel from city to city, they have money, they have progressive ideas. So people like Bessie Smith are getting cracked down on. Billie Holiday are getting cracked down. Thelonious Monk is getting cracked down on. So we see all of this happening in that later part of the prison years. All of these communist activists, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn is there for many years, Dorothy Day, as you mentioned, and eventually, yes, a number of Black Panthers, gay liberationists, radical lesbians, young lords in the late 60s and early 70s. They are all being arrested and incarcerated there as well, which is where a lot of these women meet each other and begin to realize that the Black Panthers and the gay liberationists have so much in common. The young lords and the radical lesbians have so much in common. So it becomes a center for both cruelty and community for the queer community in the later part of its existence.
Again, another great collection. I wish we had a couple of hours to talk about.
I know,
But
I always apologize to people. I'm very long-winded. You can ask me one question and I could talk at you for the next 6 hours.
Well, but you can get a lot of this by buying the book. So the Women's House of Detention. So I want to wrap up with one last question, which is really about your research and how you find these stories. You've talked a little bit about some of the sources, but finding stories and documentation of those who were threatened by the authorities and some and other members of society can sometimes be difficult to find the stories in their own words rather than the words of someone else talking about them.
Mhm.
How are you able to piece together stories really that come from the people who were involved when there may be what we call archival silences? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, this became a big deal with the Women's House of Detention because the first year of research that I did, I could not find any sources. I mean, I could find records from prisons and from the police talking about, like you said, the incarcerated folks, but I could not find records from their point of view. And I wasn't willing to write the book from the records of the police in the prison because they're not very good records for a lot of reasons. One, the people taking them are paid pretty poorly, so they don't do a very good job. Two, they automatically look at the people they're taking records on as criminals, so they sort of cut out all other information. And as I mentioned before, every 20 or 30 years, we look back and say, oh my God, everything we've done is immoral and illegal, and the records are destroyed over and over again. So after a year of looking in all the sources that I had looked for when Brooklyn was queer, the records of famous queer people, newspaper archives, diaries and letters that were kept in the libraries and all that, and finding absolutely nothing. I thought, maybe that's the reason no one's ever written this book. I know the House of Detention matters, but if the records don't exist, what can I do? And so I paused and I looked at a lot of other historians to ask myself, how are they handling these questions? How do they deal with this? And the one who turned out to be the most important one was Sadia Hartman, who wrote an incredible book called Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, which covers a lot of the same people, some of the same people that I write about in When Brooklyn Was Queer and the Women's House of Detention. And she has this methodology that she calls critical fabulation. And what this is for her is that she wanted to write about the women and girls who were kidnapped in Africa and died during the Middle Passage to slavery in the New World. So people who never even really set foot in America. Very, very little is known about these women. And she realized that if she were to write about them with the level of detail that she had, it would be thin and flat and aggregate, and it would not give any of the emotion that the other parts of the books had. And so, in a certain way, these women would always be lesser or invisibilized. And so, critical fabulation for her was a method whereby she did all of this research and then, through that research, imagined into the lives of these women to write about them. I thought, I can't do that. I am not close enough to this material. That will not work. There is no amount of research I can do that will allow me imagine something such that I would be confident to write it. But what it would allow me to do, I realized, is to imagine where their lives intersected with the kinds of power that get you into the archives. Because there's only two ways we end up in an archive, right? Either you have power, so you're famous, someone interviews you, your diaries are preserved in the house that you own, which is passed down to your granddaughter, who is not ashamed of you, so she donates them to the library. And in all these ways, you get to enter the public record under your own steam. Never going to happen for most of the people in the Women's House of Detention. The other way you get into the public record is that someone with power uses you as raw material. So doctors, journalists, politicians, prisons, all of these people are gathering information and storing it relative to what they understand about the person they're gathering information on. So a doctor records the medical information, a prison records the criminal information. I knew if I could find some kind of powerful organization that intersected with the lives of these women and was interested in their lives, that records might exist there. And as soon as I had that thought, I knew where to go, because my first job upon moving to New York was as a social worker with homeless LGBTQ youth. And I knew the kinds of records our social workers kept. They weren't just writing down what happened in a meeting, they were collecting their medical records, they were talking to their parents, they were holding on to letters and photos, they had school records, they had these robust files. And if something like that existed for the women who were incarcerated in this prison, I knew they would be talking about their ideas about desire and gender and sexuality. And it turns out New York City has the first group in the country working with formerly incarcerated women, and that their records go back to the 1800s, and they still exist today. They're called the Women's Prison Association. They have a home over on Second Avenue that they have run for over 100 years. And they had a collection at the New York Public Library of 150 boxes that no one had ever looked at. And I know no one had ever looked at them because when they were donated in the late 70s, in the early 80s, the library system was out of money, as was all of New York City, almost underwater. These boxes were donated, and the donor said, any file less than 70 years old, you have to ask us for permission to look at it because there might be sensitive information, person might still be alive. Library says, yep, that makes total sense to us. So they take the boxes, look at the boxes. They realize the files are not in chronological order. They're in alphabetical order. And they don't do permissions on a file level. They do permissions on the box level. So they look at these 140 boxes. They assume at least one, everyone has at least one file less than 70 years old. And they say, you have to ask for special permission to look at any of these materials. Now, they have so little money that if this collection is not going to be really publicly accessible, they figured there was no point in creating a finding aid for it. So no finding aid gets made. There is no description of what's in any of these boxes, and you have to find permission from this outside organization. It doesn't say how you're supposed to get permission. So after a little while, I figure out they're still around. I reach out to them. They say, honestly, we didn't even realize these things were still there. Of course, you can go look at them. No one has ever asked to look at them, ever. No one had ever, a historian of the Women's Prison Association themselves had looked at it once, and that was it. And they said to me, you're welcome to go look, but you're not going to find anything. We wish we were talking about lesbians in the 1930s, but we just don't think we were. And you hear that all the time if you're doing this kind of research. So I said, yep, you're probably right. You know better than I do. Let me just go look. And within 2 hours of sitting down, I found a 300-page file that followed a young lesbian from her first arrest for hitchhiking in the 1920s all the way up to her death in the 1960s when she was running a dog kennel in upstate New York in a place called Hope Junction. And I knew I had found the kind of archive from which I could build my book. So long-winded question, as I said, or long-winded answer to your question. That's how I do a lot of this work, is to use this methodology of critical fabulation to imagine the lives of the subject who I think is at the center of my research and ask myself, where would they intersect with the kinds of power that might end them up in archives, and then to go look for those kind of records. So it's sort of like a method of triangulation more than anything else.
As a government archivist, it is wonderful to hear you talk about the context of these people are represented. Everyone, to some extent, I knew everyone, but the government records capture a wide net of people. But it's critical to understand the context of how people got in that net. And it's great to hear you say it's not the end, it's the beginning of a deeper dive into someone's story. And so thank you for that.
Thank you for the question.
In the archives business, it's really, especially nowadays, it is critical for people to understand that there are a lot of stories and people are represented, but understanding that you're represented in there because of the power of the government and the government's perspective about you, not
I
necessarily.
mean, this is one of the things I think, young people today who are doing research using the internet, you don't learn the archive that you're going to, right? And the archive tells you all kinds of things, both, like you said, how people ended up in it, but also you need to learn the rhythm of the archive because they may be using language to mean one thing that they don't mean elsewhere, or they may use abbreviations you don't recognize. Or if you pull out just a single document, you don't understand how it arrived there or what the archive even it is that you got it from, you're not going to understand the full context of what you're seeing.
Mhm. I do hope that there are other instances of the Women's Prison Association in other communities across the United States. Hopefully there are, but what a great I'll say blessing it is for researchers to have that resource. So great.
Social work records. Social work records emerge at the same time police and prison records emerge, but they are much more concerned about the experience of the person being written about. So if there are social work records in your city or town, go look at them.
Wonderful. Good advice. We're going to turn it over to Q&A in just a second, but I want to remind everyone, and you'll get a link for those of you that signed up for this session, to Hugh's website with links to the books and how to get them. And I strongly advise you, if you are interested in learning a deeper story about a group of people that whose stories have not been told as well as you tell them, please consider that. So Josie, do we have some questions that have started to come in?
Yeah, so we actually have not any questions yet, but we do have a comment, which is that just yesterday, Angela Davis, who was being given an award in the course of the Q&A portion of the event, talked about her time in the House of Detention and first-time interactions with the lesbians and the community work that they did together. I missed that. I don't know if you did.
Yeah, yeah, I did not see that, but thank you, Janine, for sharing that. I really hope it's recorded somewhere so I can go watch it. But Angela Davis's story is incredible. Angela Davis is incredible herself. Every part of her experience with the House of Detention, and her experience with the carceral system, I would say that one of the biggest takeaways for me from researching the House of Detention was seeing how absolutely corrupt our entire prison system is and always has been. And the only people who have sort of like a theoretical understanding of the prison system in America that makes any sense after doing my research are abolitionist feminists, particularly Angela Davis, but also Miriam Kaba, Andrea Ritchie, all of these folks who are really writing from, Dereka Purnell, writing from the perspective of Black feminist theorizing about the ways in which prisons are the linchpin of oppression in our society. And that is an overarching theme throughout the Women's House of Detention. So I'm going to definitely go check that out. Thank you, Janine.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just make my own comment, which is that, as a historian myself and somebody interested in doing research, I always think it's so valuable to hear from historians who do work on people in marginalized communities about their methodologies, because it's so helpful for thinking about how you can, rethink what sources you might use or what sources you might access to get at a story. And I think it's I was taking notes when you were talking about critical fabulation and that kind of methodology. I think it's so useful to think broadly like that. So thank you for
Thank you.
sharing that with us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love, I'm not a trained historian. I love this work, but I've learned what I've learned through reading other historians and seeing what they do. So this kind of like sharing is where my whole career comes from. So I'm glad to pass some of that information on.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so another question we have here is you mentioned that in the late 19th century there was a need for a shared definition of homosexuality. Do we have that today? Does queer fill that need?
Ooh, okay. So that's a big question. I'm gonna drop in the chat. I actually wrote an entire history of this because it's a big question. But what I would say is this: we are experiencing a moment very like what I talked about at the end of the 19th century. Instead, however, of going into cities and redefining what it means to be LGBTQ because of what we were able to see through urban life, we are now going online and redefining what it means to be queer through the kinds of communities that online life allows us to see and create. So where the 20th century idea of homosexuality, transsexuality, bisexuality, all of those things is very boundaried, right? You are what you are born that way, you are that way forever. There is no amount of change or fluctuation. Bisexuality and non-binary identities, not really well understood in this 20th century model. All of that is changing because those communities that could not find each other, so folks who have non-binary gender identities, folks who have sexual desires that change throughout their lives, folks who have a sexual orientation but also experience desire caused by separate things, whether that's the person, the situation, all of these things that didn't fit neatly into our ideas of what it meant to be a homosexual or a lesbian or a transsexual. Those communities are finding each other online right now and have been for the last 30 years. So this tumult that we're experiencing where some people are saying, oh, it's rapid onset gender dysphoria and that it's all virtue signaling or these, all of that is exactly what happened at the start of the 20th century with ideas of gay identity. And it comes because, again, I'm a materialist historian. When life changes, when how we live on the macro level changes, every part of America and how we understand ourselves changes. So, urbanization in the 19th century gives us the LGBT identity of the 20th century. Whatever we want to call the internetization of America in the late 20th century gives us this new emerging queer world that we're still really in the fight of it. This backlash that we're experiencing right now. It's exactly what happens in the early part of the 1900s. The first laws specifically against homosexuality don't get written until like the 1920s. Other things get pressed into service before that. But because the community is being defined in like the 1890s and 1910s, it takes a little while for the laws to catch up. And we are experiencing that right now around new ways of being queer. This attack on, a proper medical treatment for trans-identified youth. All of this goes back to the same sort of like white supremacist, anti-queer understanding of the world that we have been battling with, queer communities, since the 1800s. So yes, queer in a way is, I would say, conceptually similar to what is emerging at the end of the 19th century as a new idea, but we're still in the middle of it and we don't know where it's all going to land yet.
Great. And then we'll just, we have time for one quick, somebody would like you to repeat your first. She says your work is so fascinating. Can you repeat the name of the scholar that you mentioned who uses that critical fabulation methodology?
Yeah, absolutely. Sadia Hartman, really an incredible scholar, brilliant, absolutely brilliant, and a really fun writer too. Sometimes she works in a really like high academic mode. Sometimes she works in a much more popular and narrative mode. Just all around brilliant scholar. Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments is her book about. It's about a lot of things, but partially about some of the queer women that I cover in my work. But the place where she defines critical fabulation is actually it's a journal article called something like The Body of Venus. I can find it. Uh, Venus in Two Acts. I think that's actually the name of it. Venus in Two Acts.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing this insightful presentation with us today and sharing all of your knowledge and work on this subject. It's been a great presentation.
Oh,
And
thank you both for making this happen. It is so kind and such an honor as a scholar to get this kind of like attention on my work. So thank you everybody for coming today too.
yes, thanks for everybody who joined us. And for those of you out there, if you're interested in learning more about the records held by the New York State Archives, please visit archives.nysed.gov. If you're interested in learning more about what we do at the Archives Partnership Trust, that website is nysarchivestrust.org. It's our privilege to make these events available to you and to keep New York State's rich history alive. If you're interested in the content we create and you have some ideas for future programming, please don't hesitate to drop us a line at aptrust@nysed.gov. And this wonderful presentation marks the end of our this season of online speaker series. So we'll be working hard in the next couple months on a schedule for next year. And we'll be back in September with a brand new lineup of speakers and stories. And you can stay updated on those presentations on our website and nysarchivestrust.org. Also, we're going to be sending out a thank you email as always that will have links to both the recording of today's presentation and also some of the resources that we've been talking about. So thank you so much. And thanks to all of you out there for a great season and have a great summer.